I also wonder, given what you just said, how much global stability relies on national instability in these exploited markets, and do we believe in conspiracy or not so conspiracy theories that the US is actually behind these coups? It would suggest that if the US is trying to maintain instability in these markets, it's because the instability actually allows for them to exploit the natural resources at a cheaper cost. Because if they were more stable and more organized and more together, then they would have the power to fight back against the exploitation that's existing.
Girl, it's a conspiracy.
Give me a tinfoil hat. Let's go. I'm ready.
Right? I'm about to rock that tinfoil hat, girl. Because I don't know.
Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to the
broadcast from later. We are exchanging weak signals of change and trying to understand their significance. A weak signal of change is just something that we notice. That's an event, an idea, an issue, a development that we don't fully understand yet, but we suspect might be meaningful in shaping the futures of our lives and society. From later, we are steadily tracking, tracing, soaking up game, and trying to make sense of what's changing. And on these broadcasts, we're giving a glimpse of what it looks like when you're trying to understand something you don't know anything about. It's basically structured like show and tell, a few of us each bring in a signal. The rest of us do not know what that item is in advance. Collectively, we try to make sense of it. If you're listening and you feel lost, you don't understand what we're talking about, that is not a problem. Neither do we. It's literally the newest stuff we know about. And I don't know anything. Everybody's just trying to figure it out as we go. So today on the room call, we have myself, Robert Bolton, our producer, Jeremy Glenn in New York City, Sydney Allen Ash, a frequent collaborator, host of the research podcast, From Later's Workplace Futures podcast, the Toenails podcast, which is a podcast about running and not running, and several other hats. What's up, Sid?
Hello. Hi. Sorry, I was on mute. I'm doing well.
Good. We have Asia Clarke back, Imi beaming in from Accra, Ghana. Asia's a researcher, writer, strategist with From Later, a crafter of beautiful jewelry and hair. Asia led Burn, recently honored by Core 77 Design Awards. Definitely check that out, burn.world, a project about the futures of Toronto and Malvern suburb. What's up, Asia? Welcome back.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much.
And also hailing from Malvern and live from Malvern today, Bianca Weeko Martin, artist, architect, curator, writer, and Bianca illustrated the map of Malvern for the Vern project. So welcome. It's great to have you here, Bianca.
Thanks for inviting me.
I want to talk about your art for a moment, Weeko. I think of it as having a really special quality of combining elements of architectural drawing and also being palimpsestic, the word you and I first bonded over. Palimpsestic in the layered ways that it kind of adds a dimension of time. And that dimension of time evokes a sense of emotional nostalgia and also kind of leaves things open for future possibilities and potential. And in a way, it can tell a lot more about spaces and buildings in some cases than a traditional architectural drawing. Can you talk a bit about that style, how it developed and how you use it?
I mean, I've always drawn, but I went to like a Catholic art high school. So I actually had a way more photorealistic art style, or like really traditionalist, like oil paintings, egg tempera icons and stuff like that. And then when I went into architecture school, I guess for the sake of practicality and mobility, I would just like keep a journal or a notebook and start drawing in very like thin and fast line work and just observing surroundings, especially with all the travel that I had in undergrad. And then last year, I had a moment to finally like step back from that kind of like organic process and get more into those theories that you mentioned, like palimpsests, and just explore different media too, like larger canvases and spray paint and like actually erasing into the drawings. So yeah, that was a moment where I could actually name, I guess, like some of the things or qualities that were appearing in my drawings. But before that, it was really just like I had a notebook. I would like steal markers from my architecture co-op placements and just like use what I had. But But yeah, and now I'm actually stepping more into using drawing as a way to like educate and like do community mapping with students and stuff. So yeah, it's still an ongoing thing, but I definitely like looking at drawing as a process rather than an artifact.
Is community mapping, I don't know if that's an existing like term, but I feel like when hearing you speak about it, knowing your particular style and like what I was alluding to before, this added like dimension of like affect and time and memory and future potential. Is that, I don't know, your brand of community mapping, a discipline, like something you might develop? And like, are you kind of developing something that's unique that students might be able to map elements that are not usually represented?
Yeah, that's a good and like ongoing question, I guess. Like even with the Vern map with Asia, it was collaborative in the scale of like two people. Like we had a phone call and we were just going through landmarks. So we thought in relation to Malvern. So there was like the Cineplex Theater and just, yeah, we were just talking, we were bantering about Malvern. And then in the context of like classrooms and students, which I'm really just like getting into right now, it's going to be these TDSB schools that are super rooted in whatever neighborhood. So there's like Central Toronto, which is in Little Italy, and then there'll be some in Regent. So it's really like a communication device with these like perhaps shy students who are going to talk about their stories and local landmarks. And yeah, the first iteration of this was, I guess, when I was in La Union in the Philippines. I presented like the architecture guide I've been working on, but I really wanted to get a perspective from the local Filipinos and like Ilocanos, because I'm still an outsider in my homeland since I didn't grow up there. So they were super shy, and they just like the first presentation, no one spoke about their spaces or shared much. And then as soon as we like laid out this giant canvas, everyone started creating a visual aid for their stories that like came later when there was more trust. I'm still like developing the brand, but those are what's happened.
Cool. And you were there because you're working on the architectural guide to Manila, right? Which will drop next year.
Yeah.
So I feel like an architectural guide designed and written by you is going to be something very surprising and full of these kinds of layered narratives. What kinds of Easter eggs can we look for in there? And will it encompass illustrations that are in your signature style?
Ooh, the Easter eggs, they're definitely an Easter egg form, because it's really funny to work with a publisher that has a very standardized layout.
Right.
Because I'm kind of just like pushing in really subtle ways to see what can fly. But at the very beginning, I will ruin this surprise, but there's a folk song called Bahay Kubo, which talks about a pre-colonial house made out of nipa. And yeah, you've probably seen it. But there's a folk song that actually talks more about the surroundings, like the vegetable and landscape around it. But it's a very known song, and it talks about architecture. So I have a spread where it's the lyrics in Filipino and in English. And then I have my drawing of a Bahay Kubo, like my family house's Bahay Kubo from my master's thesis. So yeah, there might be more drawings. Like I might get a custom cover, but that's definitely in. My publisher was like fucking with my Bahay Kubo drawing.
Sick.
Which was cool because, as I said, it's like really standardized. Like, here's a building, here's the text.
Yeah, that's good. And that should be a design principle. Always sneak your ancestral family home into the architecture guidebook.
Always.
Well, thank you for sharing about that. Let's get started. Asia, what's your weakest signal?
Okay, y'all. So my weak signal is actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's probably extremely a strong signal, but we can get into what it might signal. So over the last 5 years, there has been a bunch of coups in different African countries. Most notably, last month, the one in Niger. And I think that there's something important to be noted here, especially because some of the countries that have gone through coups over the last couple of years have been ones that have been connected to French colonialism, specifically Guinea, Mali, Niger now, and then also the Democratic Republic of Congo. So as some of you might know, I've been living between Toronto and Accra, Ghana for the last couple of years. So my ear is really keen towards African politics and geopolitical instability has been a really big theme here. And the reason why my ear kind of perked up about this Niger coup is because I was listening to a news station and it was talking about how France gets most of their uranium for their nuclear power plants from Niger. And the military coup that has taken over in Niger has now vowed to raise the price of uranium to the market standard, whereas France was getting it at a large discount from them. So what does that mean for nuclear power in France? And on a bigger scale, what do these coups in countries with lots of natural resources, especially minerals that go into like tech, like for example, cobalt in DRC, and then gold and other minerals in Sudan and also in Mali, how is that going to affect all of the tech things that we use? Could we see that the prices of electric cars or our phones or our computers go up in the next couple of years due to political instability in the places where the raw materials come from? Let's discuss.
Do you have a point of view on that so far? What's been the case?
Democracy was a beautiful word in theory, but in practice, it's really, really challenging, especially in young countries. And by young, I'm saying countries that are less than 70 or 60 years old. Most of the countries that gained independence in Africa gained it within the last 70 years. So the democracy is still forming, it's still figuring itself out. And it doesn't help that a lot of the relationships between the former colonial powers and these countries have been deeply unfair for a long time. And there are people who are in the upper classes of society who are benefiting from that imbalance. So I don't see the people who are in power being willing to give up that power very easily. Mm-hmm. And that is seen specifically in like all of these leaders of these countries who didn't want to give up power. Like, for example, like the leader of Gabon, his family basically has been in power for like the last 30 years almost. And the father was in power and then the son will be in power. And basically like a family and their friends would be the ones who are in power for this very long time. So it's often felt and thought that like most Africans living in these countries are not seeing or reaping the benefits, but the people who are in the political class or in the upper class are the ones who are being able to feel the benefit of the natural resources that are in the ground. If the military is the one who's in control and managing the resource, does that necessarily mean that like the trickle down was going to actually happen? We don't know. So I can't quite say if these coups are going to bring about the necessary change, but I can definitely say that the instability is going to affect the prices of certain raw materials. And if we're going to see that in the price of our consumer products, has yet to be seen.
How is France responding to the current demands for increasing the price of uranium? Like, have they responded?
I haven't seen anything that France has responded, but the last I saw is that the military leader has stated that he's planning to raise the price.
I can't help but draw parallels to stories that I hear about with unionization in so many different fields and workers' demands for fair compensation. And the signal that you're bringing up is obviously happening on a much larger scale in a completely different context. But I wonder if you can see this signal as also being related to fights for fair pay and ownership of the means of production and, conversations like that are happening in Western media.
Totally. Capitalism as a system that breeds scarcity. That's my opinion. If somebody's making money from these natural resources, you damn know somebody else is not eating as well as they should.
Yeah.
That's how I feel about it.
It's an interesting signal that you bring up. And I like the detail that you added, like the caveat that like, yes, there are these demands to increase the cost of these natural resources, and that in an ideal world that would trickle down. But we all know the farce of the trickle down is that the trickle never fucking comes, So like if the demands are met for increasing the cost, I don't know anything about the geopolitics of all of the various examples you gave, but I wouldn't be surprised if the trickle down doesn't ever reach the mouths and pockets of people who are like the kind of workers actually extracting these materials from the earth.
I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but Taiwan and China, and I'm guessing the United States are kind of like in some sort of cold proxy war over the manufacture of chips that go into our phones and to our computers. Most of the raw materials for those chips come from like the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is deeply unstable. And I'm really trying to think about like how much our tech is expanding, and global stability really relies upon all of these computer systems working well. But nobody's really looking at like the beginning of that supply chain.
I also wonder, given what you just said, how much global stability relies on national instability in these exploited markets, and do we believe in conspiracy or not so conspiracy theories that the US is actually behind these coups? It would suggest that if the US is trying to maintain instability in these markets, it's because the instability actually allows for them to exploit the natural resources at a cheaper cost. Because if they were more stable and more organized and more together, then they would have the power to fight back against the exploitation that's existing.
Girl, it's a conspiracy.
Give me a tinfoil hat. Let's go. I'm ready.
Right? I'm about to rock that tinfoil hat, girl. Because I don't know.
What do you guys think?
Do you feel like now that you're back in Ghana, I'm not sure if you read about it before or after you came back, but do you feel the urgency more now that you're like physically and geographically like in closer proximity to these African countries, or is it really just still something like distant in like the global ether,
It feels distant, but also feels close. So for example, within the last 5 years, Burkina Faso, who is Ghana's country neighbor to the north, had a coup. Well, the nice thing about Ghana, I'll say, is like there have been many, many peaceful transfers of power. So, the first time I came to Ghana in 2016, they were having an election, and I saw signs everywhere that were saying like, Ghana is peaceful, keep Ghana peaceful. And I think that's something that Ghana really has pride about having like peaceful transfers of power. But I don't think that would always happen just because it has in the past. Like Ghana had a coup in, I think it's the early 1980s. And for some people, it was really bad for them, obviously. But then for some people, found the country really did raise up, and the military rule during that time helped structure things in a particular way. So it's not like it can't happen. That's basically the answer.
Yeah, that sounds just intense that it's around. But I don't know, because like obviously there's also so much happening when I was in the Philippines, but so much of the communication network to me is like the diaspora too. Like when they were re-electing Bongbong Marcos, it was a lot of activism happening in Canada and the US with the diaspora too. So I was just wondering if that is the case too with Niger, or if it's like more local within Africa. Yeah.
Well, okay, not for Niger, but I have a friend from Gabon who is an artist. And when that coup happened like last week, she had on her Instagram status being like, I'm so glad finally somebody's taking these people out of here. So well, if her attitude is a reflection of some of the youth in her country, that's like they're glad that something's happening and not the same thing that's been happening. You know what I mean? But like we've seen with the Arab Spring, like just because people revolt or just because government change does not necessarily mean that the country will get better.
Going back to the signal that you brought up that these coups might result in increased cost for different types of technology that utilize the resources coming from these countries. Has that happened in the past?
So far, the coup in Niger has been connected to the price of like food commodities in neighboring countries. So that's a precedent. But whether or not, because it happened with food, it could happen with tech, but maybe those supply chains are a little bit more insulated, but maybe not.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, those supply chains are super complex, and I think at that level of like things like cobalt, they're very, deliberately obfuscated, where it's like so many layers of companies trading in the manufacturing and in the supply chain process there that it becomes like almost invisible, like who's actually doing this. And I mean, what journalists have discovered is that it's essentially slave labor a lot of times, at what's been called artisanal cobalt picking, like essentially, children working with their hands to mine.
The use of the word artisanal there is appalling.
Yeah, it's always appalling.
It is always appalling.
So I mean that's going on, and then meanwhile on the other end of that, like Nvidia chip manufacturer is the highest growth stock price in the world over the past few years, and they're backlogged. There are more orders for chips than they can produce, partly because of the AI boom and the need for these types of chips and for machine learning technologies. So like that stuff is happening. Whether something like cobalt, where it's like it can be, it is available in other places in the world, and possibly other materials that can work for chips. And America is definitely trying to manufacture locally as well. So lots of changes, but all of that will affect price, I would presume. I am, as promised by the premise of this show, way out of my depths of knowledge. So everything with a grain of salt here. But this is the work for, I don't know, systems thinkers and economists. The thing that gets curious to me is the goal to sort of centralize the manufacturing. Like, is Niger looking to build a nuclear program, or like to, start putting this uranium, like start generating energy from nuclear? Those sorts of things could have huge implications for quality of life and power in the world. So I don't know. It is way beyond my depth. I also found it somewhat ironic that it's a French word, coup, that we use for overthrowing, meaning blow or strike. So signal or noise, Sid?
I don't know. I don't know if I can make a judgment call on signal or noise on this, because it's like there's two directions that my brain is going with this signal. One is like, is it going to impact the end user? Is that the signal? Or is the signal like, will it impact the worker? Or will it impact neither? Or will it impact both? I don't know. But like, those are the two channels that my brain is thinking. And I think it's more likely that we experience an increase in cost of technology, but could it be attributed back to these military coups is like maybe going to be a bit difficult to figure out. I don't have an answer.
Weeko, Pico, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm torn too. I think even though I don't know much about the economic things, like I do think there's a signal in our increasing awareness of how much things really cost, not just in tech, but I don't know, with clothes and things that just are produced in third world countries. So I think it's interesting to think about the uranium costs like that. But in terms of military coup and changes into democracy, like I think that's a bit noisy right now, because like you said, it takes so long to like make those changes in a political system. And I'm a bit stumped, but I think those are the two different themes that I see in that story.
Asia, do you think that we'll see a trickle down benefit, or you'll see a consumer increase in cost?
I think we will. I mean, I think, I'm just looking at like Ukraine war made the price of bread go up like exponentially in different parts of Africa because Ukraine was exporting grain. Everything is interconnected. And I think the spirit of it for me, as like, I guess you could call me like a neo-Pan-Africanist, is like, I would hope that African countries are able to actually manifest a democratic destiny and like have what's in the country benefit the people like as a whole, and not just like the rich upper class. Will the last couple of years of military coups in these African countries result in the type of democracy that people desire? That's yet to be seen.
Seems to be like a signal that countries like Niger and African countries are taking back control of power of some of these resources. Like it seems to be that's what the story is, that this is like a bold move to refuse to give up these resources in this way. And so what comes of that, that should change things. I think there's going to be so much like geopolitical negotiating and deal making, and it's just way beyond me that at work there in terms of like development from places like China entering, and the power plays at work are just beyond me in this case.
Yeah, and you know what? Militaries need money too. That's the other part.
For sure. I don't predict that it's going to change the cost of an iPhone or whatever in the near future significantly, but I just say that because the powers that be need the economics of these things to work in such a way where people have to be able to spend the money to buy these things, and in some ways it has to balance out, but I could be wrong. about that, or maybe it does happen.
But also, like, the price of an iPhone goes up, as an example, the price of an iPhone goes up every single time there's a new iPhone. So it's kind of like inscrutable, like where that cost increase comes from.
Yeah. It's most of it's not from the cost of materials for Apple, I think.
Or they could say it is to make it a good PR story, but like it's, how would we know? We wouldn't know.
Yeah. So I don't know. In terms of that piece, I'll say noise, but it's clearly a significant geopolitical event. Weeko, what's your weakest signal?
So my signal, it's silly, it's cute. So I just saw this ad maybe a week or two ago on my Instagram, and it's an ad for, I guess, an app called Dance Greetings. Have you seen it at all? Okay, I was wondering like what I'm doing to get the algorithm to suggest this for me, but it's like the app Cameo, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the celebrities making greetings. Yeah, so it's essentially that, but instead of a celebrity, you get a group of like shirtless dudes from either Africa or Bangladesh. That's like on the list of options. You can pick like dancers from Bangladesh, Africa, girls, Jungle Boys, and Rashid. Like those are the categories that I saw on the website. Yeah, so
oh no.
I'm just like, it's very mystifying because at first glance, like it's kind of cute. They're like very spirited dancers. But then when you look a little bit closer, and they actually like, I guess they hand make a sign with the recipient's face on it, and like they handwrite things. So I was thinking about like maybe this is the return to the analog. The weird part that I found was that there's a kind of caveat saying that you're like helping these people out of poverty, but at the same time you're, I don't know, reveling in their poverty aesthetics. Like, not that it's necessarily poverty, it's like really just like rural third world country, but and I'm not sure why it's just the options are like Bangladesh versus all of Africa. But yeah, what was on my mind when I saw this was, I guess, the analog aspect, I guess our relation to these third world countries. And I guess like for me, it's a bit complicated because when I was in the Philippines, I was spending more time in like rural parts, surf towns, where there was a lot of like migration from the cities to the more like simple and like seaside areas where a lot of like artists and cultural people from the cities were escaping to. And so the feeling I get when I see this is similar to how I felt there, where it was like there's a lot of respect and like envy in a way, but there's also like this is like a little belittling. So those feelings I'm like kind of trying to unpack. I shared this story with Rob before, but I kind of fell in love with this like surfer man's in Siargao, in a small island in the Philippines. And most of the guys there who were surfers were like full on hunter-gatherer, like fisherman types. And I had like invited some friends. Well, I invited him over to my place at the time. And he called me, he was like, yeah, I'm not really like a room person. And in that moment, I was like, I don't want to be a room person. Like I just felt like the hierarchies or whatever, like who was cool, or the hierarchies that you usually get in the city, in Manila, were reversed there. So yeah, that's kind of my ramble. But I didn't know if people had seen this or if it's just like coming up on my feed, and whether this is really going to be like the new Cameo, and whether we're just like over celebrity culture. But that is my signal.
What is going on in the FAQ section of this site? That's what I need to see. And who owns this company and who runs it? Who's making money off this? And who are the main consumers? Like, I just saw the one example on the homepage looked like a white guy. And then maybe one other said Johnny, which like isn't necessarily a white guy, but I couldn't see the photo. But like, who? I need to know the power dynamics at play behind this thing.
Are the people getting exploited? Of course not.
Happy smiley face. Said every exploited person ever.
Girl, I had so many questions. I was deeply confused by this. First of all, Bianca, what are you searching, girl?
I didn't search it. It sent it to me.
That's my first. The second question: or comment is not greetings from Africa. Y'all, what?
Like greetings from Africa, but there's also one that just said greetings from jungle, just jungle.
And Rashid.
And who's Rashid? Who's Rashid? Like, oh my gosh, this is too much. You know why it's exploitative? Because all these men have their shirts off.
Yeah.
So imagine this was women. Somebody trying to put on some bras. Sorry, you guys, but I'm just deeply appalled by this.
I'm looking at the charity project section of their website, and I'm still very confused about who like runs this and who's making money off this. But they have these updates from June. If you scroll down to the very bottom, they start at June, and they're talking about funding that they're giving, but it's vague. You know, there's a donation was made, money went here, these resources went there to these kids. But it like the mode of fundraising, it feels like not as serious as this, but it feels very much like in the lineage of like sex tourism a little bit. Like it's just the way that all the guys have their shirts off and they're young. And I'm like,
yeah, that's it.
And
that's it.
You know, like that's what this feels connected to. And so that's why I need to know who runs this thing, you know, to actually make that judgment.
There's apparently a sale right now on their greeting video from Eastern Europe. It's just women.
Oh my God.
It's more expensive still than the...
There's one, greeting video from Eastern women, and they're all in Playboy bunny outfits.
What?
Oh gosh.
Not a sale.
Yeah, it's
not a sale.
Weird.
I didn't even see the price.
Oh God, not a sale price.
Like this doesn't look like it's made in the US. Like it doesn't look like the company is based in the US and that they're farming this out to other places in the world. But then at the same time, I don't understand the decision to do this. I don't understand. Are people like participating?
I didn't see like the individual posts and like how much activity was on them or whatever. Like I mean they do have kind of testimonies, but it literally came up on my feed like a week or two ago, and I think it does like still continue to come up, and I'm mystified at why it's targeting me.
So let's talk more about the feeling of why it's off-putting, and whether, you know, why is it different from outsourcing or offshoring any other form of labor in a way that's exploitative because the price of labor might be cheaper.
It's the shirtless dancing for me. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an extreme, but I definitely thought of business processing outsourcing centers that are huge in the Philippines. Like that's definitely a building type that is in my guide where, you know, you have call centers that hire a lot of Filipino / like English speaking third world country inhabitants where they do the customer service, and they actually have to work like overnight shifts, and the buildings are designed so that you can just stay within the confines and like get all the food, and like you have a dorm and you just like live in this nighttime reverse schedule space. And so I guess I saw this as a form of that outsourcing, but at like a very, very wild end of the spectrum. And of course, with just breaking a different set of ethics too, with like the exhibitionism, basically.
Yeah.
But I wanted to know like what the appeal would be to the people who do order these.
Yeah, that's the real mystery. I mean, I guess it's just novelty. I guess it's just like, this is a crazy thing my uncle got me for my, you know, wedding. Like,
it's more than novelty. Like this is like real like minstrel kind of shit, you know, like that's what this is, you know. It's not just like, oh, wacky thing. It's like, look at all these black and brown people doing a funny dance, and for me, like it's and look, they're in these foreign environments to me, and look, they're being like silly and happy and fun, and oh, it's the charity and I'm giving the money to charity, and I'm like, this is all dubious. The thing that complicates it for me is like, this looks homemade. It looks like it's made by just a small number of people. It looks like a small operation. It looks like really kind of DIY. And so that complicates it even further, that I'm like, who is DIYing this and playing into these themes and this lineage of exploitation? And is it fine to play into it if you're doing it yourself? You know, like everyone should have the agency to use their body however they want, you know, but it is, I just need to know who runs this. I need to know who's making most of the money.
Something that's off-putting about this, it is in fact the charity aspect of it, as you're talking about, but it's just like there's a lot of scholarship on the use of Black and brown bodies, adults and children, in advertising for charities in parts of, you know, the global south or in developing countries, and like how certain pictures and certain videos elicit a bigger response in donations. So I think that's a part of what is off-putting for me. As you said, like the minstrel kind of like performative happiness is absolutely also part of the off-putting part.
And that it's majority men too also feels like it kind of even more suspicious than if it was women somehow.
Yeah, why? What's that about? Why is that?
There's something almost like knowingly subversive going on here.
Yeah, like why they all gotta have a shirt off? Why can't they be dancing with shirts on?
Well, because it's like sexual. It's like it's slightly sexual. That's why, you know.
It's infantilizing. It's like that's like also what's going on here. It's a bit emasculating, and the fact like they're wearing party hats and like holding balloons and stuff. So and like the person who's receiving the gift, like, yeah, it's a grown white man, apparently.
But do you remember in high school, at least like my era of high school, they had these volunteerism trips to Africa and like parts of South America. So I don't know if they still do that or if this is just like way more blatant than.
They definitely do have it still, volunteerism. And it's like, especially, I don't know, like public schools, it's one thing, but I think also in Catholic schools in Canada and America, and probably in Europe, like a part of it comes with the ideology of spreading the good word, if not like explicitly, then implicitly. Like I guess for me, like I just feel like once you put charity on top of anything, like it just makes it feel even ickier, even though they were trying to make it be less ick. It just feels like too much.
Yeah, there's like a whole semiotics of just like it being this kind of janky site and like what our responses are to like what we see as legitimate in terms of like web design and stuff like that as well. Like there's so much in what we see here that affects, I think, like how we interpret it, how we receive this information and the assumptions that we make about it.
Can we pause it for a second and think about how we would feel if this was like, you know, for the video from Bangladesh, if it was Bangladeshi people who made this company and who saw that this would be a profitable way for them and their peers, you know, in this hypothetical situation. I don't know if this is how this is running, but like, how would we feel about that if it was ran by and for the people who were perceiving as being kind of exploited?
Doesn't make me feel that much different about the demand. You know what I mean? Because like there's the demand side of this, like who's buying this and why.
Yeah, I think in that case it would go down to class, and there is a lot of economic and class disparity in a country like Bangladesh, like the Philippines, and so it would almost be more messed up if it was like the top 1% elite of Bangladesh running this to exploit people within their same. I don't know. I think it would be more messed up.
I mean,
what if they're in the same class? If it was all these people who are all like, yo, you know what people
like cosplaying
New York would, but no, not even that. Like what if all these guys got together, team dance greetings, and they were like, yo, you know what people would buy over in, you know, LA or whoever is ordering this shit. I have no idea. But you know what they would buy? Videos of us and our boys with our shirts off doing a funny dance. What if it was like that? It was like a lateral, we're in the same level, we're recognizing this trend and this opportunity. What if it was like that? How would we feel about that?
Well, that could be sick. Like if then the joke's on the Americans.
Well, you know what it says right here? It says Team Africa. We used to struggle to make ends meet. but now we can earn way more than we ever thought possible. Instead of working in low-wage and manufacturers, we were able to do a fun job and make people happy.
Is that real? Is that verified? Who'd that come from?
ChatGPT wrote that shit.
We need some real investigative journalism. Someone needs to order one of these and find out the process.
Yeah.
Order one of these and then try to return it, talk to customer service, find out the process. That's what needs to happen. Like, the feeling behind this changes drastically when you think about who is making money from it.
For sure.
It, like, there is still the question of what you're saying, like the demand drop, for sure. That's questionable, but that's always been there. Like, white people want to see non-white people appeasing them, you know? So that is like kind of less surprising to me. But what could be interesting here is like, who is in on the joke?
For sure. I mean, there's whole industries of media like emerging of just people in various parts of the world and often in third world countries just like doing everyday stuff. And it's just sort of like, oh, people watch this and I can make money on ad revenue on YouTube or whatever. And like, this is a question, like, how do you feel about those types of things? Like, some people do want to celebrate like that, if you want to call it social media, or just like these types of media channels, like we allow people to, you know, live their lives and find new types of revenue and whatever. But who's always benefiting is the platform, as we know. And so I'm curious, like, beyond the like moral judgment based on like what we're not sure about here, like as a signal, what do we feel like this signals in the course of like the emergence of YouTube into things like OnlyFans and the different ways that these types of services and Cameo along the way can be offered? Like, is there in that trajectory and lineage, what's changing? Is there a signal of something that's changing? Is this different, or is it something else?
Maybe it's the signal of like, it could be as innocent as somebody just like wanting a video, but it also could be somebody wanting to see a bunch of young men shaking and dancing for a very, very borderline sexual thing. And like, it's passing through that border because their pants are on. And because the website is so like strange, and like the copy is just so strange to me. Whenever I see really strange copy, I'm like, this is either somebody whose English is not like their first language, which is fair, or it's just ChatGPT saying whatever the fuck she's saying. I was
just saying that kind of the idea of like what you can sneak by censorship, essentially, where you can sneak past censorship and how that goes on in social media from people. Like hashtags like get ready with me, which like tends to be, it's like women changing, and it's not pornographic, but it is sort of like, that's basically what's going on. So there's like grown women doing the changing, and like the audience is probably supposed to be people who can't access pornography. So it's like mostly younger, underage men in many cases. And like nobody like necessarily talks about that. And it's very easy to like turn your own eye to what you might be doing when you're participating in something like that, and whether that's like okay in our society. But then I was saying, if you watch old media, if you watch any movies that I watched growing up, like rewatch those things, often these like movies for kids have these like hypersexualized moments, and that would be like somehow ambiguous enough, disguised with innuendo. And like when you think of like what innuendo is, it's just like, oh, we're just like gonna say it without saying it. And so there's just strange ways that we kind of sneak things by that are like, oh yeah, like it is weird to make that type of media. Like for, I don't know, I rewatched the Jim Carrey movie The Mask, and it's Cameron Diaz, I think, and it's just like, I watched it and I'm like, oh, it's really weird that I like was watching this shot of this woman at the age that I was when this film came out, like, and that somebody made that movie knowing exactly what they're doing or whatever. I don't have strong feelings about whether it's good or bad, but I think that it's very strange given like what our sort of stated like morals are about these kinds of issues versus like what we're okay with if it sneaks by the line.
I don't know, maybe because we are aware of and like really cognizant about like what exploitation can look like. This could be so innocent to somebody who doesn't necessarily have like that knowledge, but because we are educated in that regard and give a damn, this feels deeply strange for us. This is so weird to me.
It's so weird. Bianca, great pick. If it was an individual or even a group, but they were doing it on Twitch or something like that. So we know that they are the streamers, or we could feel a little bit more sure that they are the streamers because that's like the common model on that platform. And then that would actually be more adjacent to like this whole NPC thing, like ice cream, gang, all that kind of stuff. And so if it fell into that model more seamlessly, then I would be less alarmed. But because it's in an organization that's a charity, that structure makes me feel like exploitation, because you're a company doing this. Like,
there's some sequence of like things that have like almost the defensiveness of the website too, that is just putting up red flags for sure.
I think a lot about Bali too, and how it's become this hub for like life coaches and people who are essentially like creating similar content. Like they're not dancing, but they're outsourcing themselves in a third world country that is like welcoming to tourists and whatever. I don't know. I just like, I feel like there's like something geographic too in this, where you have like the jungle as a type, and there are just so many questions around where this is based. Like, yeah, it's all confusing, but
yeah, because the like, I'm trying to think about analogous examples as well. Like, I've seen on Instagram or like trickled down from TikTok into Instagram, like videos of like hockey bros who are probably 21 with their shirts off and their funny, perfect hair, and they're doing their little TikTok dance, and it's not overtly sexual, but it's, it's sexual, like in the way that all of the internet is. And somehow that doesn't read as exploitative because it's a bunch of 21-year-olds from New Jersey or something, but this does. And I think highlighting the geographic part also is a really good note, because this plays into like colonial fantasies too, which is also why I think this feels so uncomfortable. I don't know what this is a signal of, but there's a lot happening.
Let's quickly, because we got to move on. Said signal and noise.
Yeah, I guess it's a signal of how complicated on-demand content models can disrupt means of production or obscure means of production or something like that. I don't know if that was just a bunch of jargon and didn't mean anything, but there's signal in there and I don't know what it is.
That's good. That's what we do here. Asia, signal or noise?
For me, it's giving signal, y'all. Signaling what? Just like the descent into like the climate crisis. I don't know, man. Like, yeah, it was just so strange for me. I don't know, like, but I will say that there's something to be said for people using the charity model to like obscure concerns about the ethics behind a thing. Like if people are getting the if like we can guarantee that people are getting the money from this, so should you be a hater? And I'm gonna say yes, because their shirts did not have to be off.
Well, yeah, one, I think that's super interesting is that there's something about the like mix of whatever felt like sexual or something that was going on there. I actually found it was like more like emasculating than sexual or something, just my perspective. But whatever was going on there mixed with charity, there's like some mixed message thing that goes on that's very off-putting for people. So for me, a lot of this that I can't call either, but I'll say what it is a signal of is that you can learn everything you need to know about someone, Bianca in this case, from the For You page. If you want to know someone, just get them to screenshot it and send their
on my Finsta.
Yeah, particularly on their Finsta, not on their real Instagram, but on their Finsta. Yeah. Sid, what's your weakest signal?
Okay, so I am broadly interested in the evolution of language when it comes to both wanted and unwanted sex. So sex and then rape or sexual harassment or stuff in that world. Tangentially connected to that is the mainstreaming of kink culture. And my signal is related to how language from kink culture is used by people in the mainstream to to get the sex that they want or try and get the sex that they want, and how language that is referencing a consensual power imbalance can be manipulated by someone who has desires to create an unconsensual power imbalance. My signal is this thing that happened to me several months ago that I cannot stop thinking about. And it happened on this app Field, which is a dating hookup sex app, sort of, started in Berlin. It's like 9 years old now, but it really rose to prominence in the past probably year and a half, 2 years. I've been on Field since the end of December, beginning of January, and I've had a lot of very interesting interactions, both positive and negative. The thing that I find interesting about it, just to kind of set the stage for those who haven't been on it, Field is design-wise very much similar to, like a Tinder or a Hinge or whatever. There's profiles, and you scroll by the profiles and you click on one to connect with that person, or you swipe left to get them away from you. The difference being on Field, in contrast to other dating apps, is the level of transparency that I would say, like, I could say, like, the core users, the people who actually use Field differently than other apps, the transparency in which they employ in their bios, and just like the level of conversation that they'll have with you. So like, you could, like, someone's hypothetical bio, it could be like, it's very normal to scroll by one that's like several paragraphs long and is like incredibly specific about what their situation is. They're like, oh, I have a long-term open partner in, the West Coast, and I am looking for, non-monogamous play partners here when I'm traveling. I'm into XYZ things. I'm not into ABC things. I have experience with this. And it's like long and thorough and very transparent, in contrast to what I feel like the tone is on like a Hinge or a Tinder, which is kind of aloof or like faux earnest. People like looking for someone to go on adventures with. I'm just like, shut the fuck up. Or just like, must love tacos, like stuff
concerned
like that
about
is
whether
very
pineapple
common.
should be on pizza.
Sure, like, is a hot dog a sandwich? Like, just this weird, like really lame, like, type of talking. That's kind of like old tweets.
Opinions
or
for
like
boring
that.
people. Yeah.
Back to the point. So Field is different in some ways. The interactions I've had on there are really interesting to me. I had one in particular, and this is what my signal is. I had one in particular where I was messaging with this guy when I was in New York last, which was like in April. And we matched and we started talking while I was on the train to go to a bar. And we were talking, and he was like, pretty immediately, he got like pretty sexual on the app, which can happen. And like, sometimes that's okay. And sometimes you're just like not into that. And you're like, I'd like to get to know you first before we talk about, our intimate sexual interests. He was like, oh, it's because I'm a pleasure dom. So it's my responsibility to know what you're into. And like, on Field, and increasingly elsewhere, but especially on Field, there's a lot of like labels, and there's a lot of like little acronyms like this, like ENM, like ethically non-monogamous, consensually non-monogamous, daddy dom, pleasure dom, brat, baby, princess, dominatrix, like FFM, FMF, like just like loads and loads of labels and categories, And so this guy uses this one, pleasure dom, which like is supposed to imply that like you are like a dominant person, but you get off on getting your partner off. So it's like not that dissimilar from just like normal sex, but he used this phrase in a way that was the first time he used it in our conversation. And he used it in a way that was almost like trying to get me to consent to a type of intimate conversation that I wasn't ready to have, under the guise that, oh, this is his responsibility under this newfound label of a pleasure dom, and has this been his thing forever? Has it not been his thing forever? I don't fucking know him. I don't know. But the dynamic felt very similar to experiences we've probably all had in the past, especially as women, where men try to like trick you into sex, or think they're going to trick you into sex. Like, just come, like, oh, you don't even like me that much. Or like, oh yeah, just come for a drink. Like, oh, come over to my house. We'll have a whatever. Like, just like they think that they're tricking you, by using these tactics. And this language, this use of this phrase, pleasure dom, felt like he was demanding something from me by using this label. And I hope I'm explaining this clearly. I'll give you another example. So we were talking, whatever. And I was like, hey, I got to go. Like, I'm at this bar with my friends and I'll talk to you later, whatever. Throughout the night, he sends me a bunch more messages. I don't reply to anyone because I'm not looking at my phone. And then the next morning I go to the gym, still don't reply to him. And then it's like maybe 10 o'clock in the morning. And he's like, he sent me a whole bunch of messages at this point. And he's like, what are you doing right now? I want to take you out for drinks. I'm in pleasure dom mode. And I was like, this is like, you're using this phrase that actually is supposed to mean that you're into what I want, but you're using it for you to get what you want, you know? And the signal to me to unwind out of this whole story is the way these new, even though they're not new phrases, but like new to the mainstream phrases are used by people who are not necessarily from these like more respectful, consensual kink communities, the way the language is being used to still get what they fucking want. You know what I mean? And I'm just interested how this trend in language will evolve over time and further complicate conversations that are already very tricky around consensual and non-consensual sex.
I think a lot of those terms are also borrowed from like queer culture and queer sex communities, like a dom, like the base of that word. So I haven't heard of pleasure dom, but I also find it kind of twisted that he's appropriating that. And then I also was reminded of that Jonah Hill like implosion that happened with his ex, where in that case, I guess therapy speak and therapy terms were being appropriated or misused. Like I think it's a really specific kind of vocabulary where does it generalize things? Like they're all really heavy
It
words.
obfuscates things, actually.
Yeah.
I completely agree. On one hand, we would want people to learn vocabulary to be able to use it in the right ways. But this is a perfect example of somebody who has, like, I guess, nefarious intention can use that vocabulary to their advantage. And I totally see where you're coming from. It's like, are you trying to do like Jedi mind tricks on me?
Yeah, right?
With my own language? I guess the signal that you're pointing to is the use of language that is intended to create liberating spaces is being taken and used by people who intend to either abuse or just take advantage of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that is definitely a very dangerous, slippery slope.
Yeah, that's a great summary of it, that it is like that these phrases can be liberating, but when they are misused or misappropriated to serve someone else's interests, then they completely can be like diluted, you know, and can lose their original connection to a free and subversive and liberating experience.
I guess like the interesting thing here is like the line in the case that you're telling us about, Sid. It's like this is other argument of like this is like as transparent as this guy could be. I trust that your reading of the vibe is right. But if it wasn't, it's like interesting to hear it described as like part of the pattern of like tricking someone into sex when it's like it's leading with this every time in like the most obvious words too. And I mean, the term, I agree, like pleasure dom, like is that like that's like a benevolent dictator or something like that. But yeah, I don't know what to make of it exactly. And like in a case like that, I guess isn't the point of these kinds of things where it's just like you can go like unmatched or whatever.
Yeah.
And you just don't have to deal with it when such a feeling comes up.
Yeah, of course you can utilize the unmatched feature. But what I think is more nefarious is that they're utilizing transparent language to put their needs, you know, out in the open and communicate openly. But the manipulation of these phrases, it obscures the actual manipulation that's happening underneath the surface. Being a pleasure dom, if that's your thing, or being a dom of any kind, it's like that's a responsibility that requires like a lot of thinking and planning and like respect, and like you ask someone what they're into and you create the circumstances where that person can explore that thing. Like, you're the director, right? Saying, I'm in pleasure dom mode, I want to take you to drinks, that's actually not centering the other person's experience at all. That's not considering their interests. That's not considering what they're into. It's not considering their needs. And so it's like actually not even behaving. So it's disingenuous.
Oh, I see.
Because you're not actually behaving like a pleasure dom, because the pleasure dom would like kind of figure out what you're into, hence the word pleasure, figure out what pleases you, and then take it upon themselves to make that situation happen.
It's also assuming you're a pleasure sub. Like, I feel that the whole dichotomy of sub and dom, like, it's because of that need to assign the role, like at least in like the origins in queer culture. So it's kind of presumptuous too.
Yeah.
I'm also a pleasure dom, but I want you to leave me the fuck alone.
And I want a milkshake. Get the fuck out of here. Like it's like what the fuck? Yeah, it's because it is a tricky thing. It is a tricky thing to talk about. Like I still had a conversation just the other day about the Aziz Ansari story that ran on babe.net like several years ago. That also addressed not the same thing, but also addressed just like tricky, complicated sexual dynamics. And I think when you throw in language like this, that, presupposes built into the name is a power imbalance, right? And that already challenges the very kind of politically correct approach to sex in culture now, which is you get consent, right? But when you have these phrases and these interests that they require consent, but maybe in a container, like you consent over there and then now we're in this world and like it's different, but homeboy was just fucking wielding that shit.
Yeah, I mean, it's like sort of that there's like jargon excludes. That's like what it does at the end, end of the day. So it's like, not to say jargon's not useful, it is in particular ways, but like when you start using language, you start creating containers, and do they mean the same things to the people you're talking to? That's a big challenge of being in dialogue that requires more check-ins. But like, yeah, if you just throw a word and someone's like, that's perfect, that's a match for me or whatever, I think you make a good point that these things can be used in sneaky ways or weaponized or just like become a cheap sort of shibboleth or something like that. That's like, immediately forms some sort of bond of trust, or is trying to. Sometimes like a word with a positive connotation, it's like once that's like built in and a lot of people have that, it becomes like this cheap way of like ingratiating oneself. And it's done through like business. Obviously businesses do it with words like diversity and, or that scams do it with words like charity or whatever. Or
Republicans do it with words like woke.
Yeah. Well, that's like a whole different changing of the
way. That's a whole other rabbit hole.
But but it's done with other politicians do this with words constantly, and you have to sort of like has to makes it so that you have to keep yourself on your toes for sure. So we should wrap up. Signal or noise, Bianca?
I think it's a signal. I think the parallels between different specialized fields in their jargon, or like fields, communities, whatever. So therapy speak, dating apps, or just kink language, like you said. And then like the HRification of friendships. Like I think those are all related. And it's probably going to be really urgent to scrutinize language, and words seem to be changing rapidly, or more rapidly. I don't know, that could be bullshit, but that's my take on the signal.
Asia?
I would say it's noisy just because language changes all the time. And there's probably a lot of examples in history of like the meanings of words changing, especially in political spaces. I don't know, man. It's weird. I think I'll just leave it there.
I think it's a signal for sure. For me, the takeaway in terms of like where to go with it is just like increasingly we have to be aware of one word labels that kind of constitute a certain like bucket or category, and whether we can identify with one word labels, because even if it's about a particular sexual preference or activity, it's not enough. And we oversimplified some of these things with like who we identify with. It's like this person is this, whatever, politically, sexually, whatever it may be. and therefore we're of the same tribe. And it's like, it's not the case. And what that requires different types of like dialogue and an ability to like actually talk through something. And it's like, yeah, you don't get in bed metaphorically or literally like with someone just because they like say the keyword or something. Like there's a lot more that needs to happen to ensure understanding,
Safety.
and yeah, sure, and safety. And so like that's sort of like where we're at. Broadcast from later. My favorite thing I keep thinking about from today is Weeko saying not being a room person. That's my new favorite. Not a room person. I'm not a room person. I'm not a Zoom person either.
Biggest diss of my life.
That's so funny.
It's so interesting. Yeah.
Take the walls down. No ceilings.
Yeah, he also, the same guy, like we would surf off the fishing boats, and he like caught a bunch of fish and made it into Filipino ceviche like right after I surfed. And I was like, where am I gonna find a man in Toronto?
You're not. You're not, babe.
Girl.
You're not. Get out of Toronto.
Get some frozen shrimp
Yeah.
from the grocery store.
Don't rely
No
on a
shade,
man
sorry.
in Toronto.
No shade.
Sorry.
No shade.
I'm a Toronto man's hater. I don't give a fuck.
Sometimes I feel like I'm the Toronto man, but
No.
Nah. Don't do that to yourself. You can code switch maybe,
Shitting.
but you're not.
As Rob is like quiet in the corner.
Yeah.
No comment from
Are
Rob.
you a Toronto man?
Are you trying to speak
Yeah.
for your kind,
all tell me.
Rob?
Okay, y'all.
Thank you. Bye.